following reading is from Richard I Massacre's Prisoners after taking Acre, the 2nd to the 20th of August, 1191, a Saracen view of the Crusades. This proposition the Sultan rejected, knowing full well that if he were to deliver the money, the cross and the prisoners, while our men were still kept captive by the Christians, he would have no security against treachery on the part of the enemy, and this would be a great disaster to Islam. Then the King of England, seeing all the delays interposed by the Sultan to the execution of the treaty, acted perfidiously as regards to his Mussulman prisoners. On their yielding the town of Acre, he had engaged to grant them life, adding that if the Sultan carried out the bargain, he would give them freedom and suffer them to carry off their children and wives. If the Sultan did not fulfill his engagements, they were to be made slaves. Now the king broke his promises to them and made an open display of what he had until now kept hidden in his heart, by carrying out what he had intended to do after he had received the money and the Christian prisoners. It is thus that people in his nation ultimately admitted. In the afternoon of Tuesday 27th, Rajab, 20th of August, about 4 o'clock, he came out on horseback with all the Christian army, knights, footmen, Turcopoles, light armed soldiers of the Order of the St. John of Jerusalem, and advanced to the pits at the foot of the hill of Ayadiyeh, to which place he had already sent on his tents. The Christians, on reaching the middle of the plain that stretches between this hill and that of Kaysan, close to which place the Sultan's advance guard had drawn back, ordered all the Mussulman prisoners, whom martyrdom God had decreed for this day, to be brought before him. They numbered more than 3,000, and were all bound with ropes. The Christians then flung themselves upon them all at once, and massacred them with sword and lance in cold blood. Our advance guard had already told the Sultan of the enemy's movements, and he sent it some reinforcements, but only after the massacre. The Mussulmans, seeing what was being done to the prisoners, rushed against the Christians, and in the combat, which lasted till nightfall, several were slain and wounded on either side. On the morrow morning our people gathered at the spot and found the Mussulmans stretched out upon the grounds as martyrs for the faith. They even recognized some of the dead, and the sight was a great affliction to them. The enemy had only spared the prisoners of note, and such as were strong enough to work. The motives of this massacre are differently told. According to some, the captives were slain by way of reprisal for the death of those Christians whom the Mussulmans had slain. Others say that the King of England, on deciding to attempt the conquest of Ascalon, thought it unwise to leave so many prisoners in the town after his departure. God alone knows what the real reason was.
This podcast was recorded before Palestinian Hamas terrorists massacred over 1,300 Israelis, mostly civilian men, women and children, on the 7th of October 2023. The title of this show is Bloody Violent History, and today's subject could be said to be close to the centre of the premise of this podcast. Our subject today is massacre. Human history, our past, has borne witness to massacre on all continents bar Antarctica, and in all time periods during the ascent of man. Before we continue, I should mention that we are in sight of the end of our third series. If you've enjoyed our shows, please take a moment to give us a review. Now to proceed. The Encyclopaedia Britannica 11th edition gives the definition for massacre as the wholesale indiscriminate killing of persons. The Oxford English Dictionary defines massacre as a general slaughter of people, a carnage. The origin of the word is obscure. Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus fires a shiver down the spine when he announces, "For I must talk of murders, rapes, and massacres." It is a difficult subject, so we have divided it into 5 areas to try and make sense of why murder lurks in the human heart. The 5 are: foundation, when a massacre abets or triggers the foundation of a nation; genocide, the deliberate destruction, killing of a group of people; rampage, an act of violence which gets out of hand and leads to massacre. Exploitation, brutality, which leads to a complete destruction of empathy, and again, massacre. And lastly, cull, an almost mechanical exercise in killing to tie up loose ends. Before we discuss these, let's consider first what is happening today at the Ukrainian-Polish border, and then shift our minds back to 1943.
Well, you didn't want to be in East Galicia, that part of Poland-Ukraine, in 1943, because it was when the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, decided to go out and massacre Poles, mostly women and children. They saw the Poles as a threat. They thought that were there any post-war settlement, Poland might take over that part of Ukraine, what they considered to be Ukraine, that had a Ukrainian majority. And they went out to kill them. That is why in July 2023, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and the Polish Premier stood side by side in Volhynia and paid respects to the victims. Some say it was between 50 and 100,000 innocents.
So what, they were patching up that particular open sore?
Yes, not only was it an open sore, but it shows how massacre sort of goes through human history. It's really a waypoint. The mass graves caused by massacres are stepping stones through history. You've mentioned those 5 areas we're going to talk about, but it demonstrates that massacre is part of the human condition. It's a frightful part of the human condition, but it is often there. And massacre can either be a spasm of violence, or it can be considered and pragmatic approach by the authorities, or by, in this case, Ukrainian Insurgent Army. It's there as part of nationalism. It can be fueled by religion, ethnicity, politics. It has so many strands to it, and it can often mark the start of conflict or the end of conflict. And quite often, it showcases a nation. It enters the foundation myth of a nation, and it creates sores that last a long time, undercurrents that last a long time.
Well, the beginning of the Second World War, when the Soviets had their pact with the Nazis, there was another massacre which involved the Soviets and the Poles as victims at the Acheton woods in April-May 1940.
It's worth talking about because what I want to look at really is both the sort of hands-on approach and the arm's length approach to things such as massacres. And the Acheton wood, 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals murdered by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in 1940. It was totally barbaric. And if you want a hands-on example of what happened, the NKVD chief executioner, the Lord High Executioner of Joseph Stalin, was a guy called Vasily Blokhin. And this man, out of the 22,000, is believed to have killed 7,000 with his Tokarov pistol. And if you actually do the maths, Tom, it is hideous. I mean, it lasted, people say, about 28 days. If he kills 7,000, that's 250 a day. So he was really killing one person every 2 minutes. He got through 31 magazines of his Tokarov pistol. It was absolutely extraordinary, but this is what was expected of these executioners. And it shows how brutalizing not only the security state can be, but how brutalizing war can be. And all the way through history, and certainly in that region, massacres come all the way through. That's even before you get onto the Holocaust and the genocides that happened there.
So that example is a good example of how, after you fired the first bullet into the back of someone's head, firing the 7,000th bullet, you're inured to it. Death and the value of life has kind of vanished. I would like to say that actually Vasily Blokhin died an alcoholic in the 50s. So I think he was a pretty miserable specimen by the time he departed
I think he was a pretty miserable specimen when he was a major general as well in the security system of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, if we jump forward to the end of the war, when the Americans were pushing hard against the Japanese, some of them, American troops, and these would be Marines, I guess, in the Pacific, were fairly brutalized, heavily brutalized by what they had seen and how they'd had to fight.
Oh, of course. And you can tell that by the sort of general approach. I mean, it was so horrific, the war against the Japanese on the islands of the Pacific. It was so dehumanizing. I mean, Life magazine at one point had a woman holding up a Japanese skull, and the caption was, war factory worker thanks her Navy boyfriend for the Jap skull. And she's just holding up this Japanese skull.
Well, she's going to put it on the chimney piece.
Well, I mean, they were used as ashtrays. They were used as candle holders. I mean, this became standard practice. And you have a quote there of an American colonel who came across some young guys who had stuck Japanese heads on stakes, decapitated these heads and put them on stakes, facing the enemy.
I mean, these were teenage American soldiers in this war, and when he pulled them up on it, he accused them of being animals. Jesus, man, what are you doing? You're acting like animals. And this dirty, stinking kid says to him, "That's right, Colonel. We are animals. We live like animals. We eat and are treated like animals. What the fuck do you expect?"
Yeah, it just shows what war does. And we talked about the hands-on approach to massacre by NKVD executioners. If you look at the war in the Pacific and you see the sort of arm's length massacres, the Japanese, when they were losing, the pressure on Japanese civilians to kill themselves was absolutely massive. I mean, somewhere like Saipan, for example, when the Japanese were losing, they took themselves to Marpi Point, which is now known as Banzai Cliff or Suicide Cliff, and they were throwing themselves off. There's cine footage of Japanese mothers holding their babies and jumping off the cliff. It is absolutely horrendous. Then you go on to Okinawa in 1945. You had up to 100,000 Japanese civilians, and they were encouraged to take grenades and kill themselves in group sessions with grenades. And that, in a sense, is sort of massacre by default. It's certainly sort of arm's length massacre. But this is what war can do. This is what can happen.
And if the conditions of massacre are so appalling that people to get out of it will try and kill themselves because it's a fate worse than the torture and terrible things that are going to be done to them in the interval.
And you can believe the propaganda about the other side as being hellish and damnable and everything else. So you don't want to fall into their hands. And at the same time, not only does it mean you don't want to fall into their hands, it means that when they fall into your hands as captives, you are going to treat them as beneath any kind of dignity, and so butchery ensues.
Bo Meng, who is a survivor of the Pol Pot Cambodian genocide, said that prisoners were trying in every way to commit suicide. When they ran out of useful information, prisoners were sent to the killing fields. Child prisoners were taken away from their families and sent to the killing fields, where they were smashed against the Chankiri tree.
Oh, and so many people know the Chankiri tree. I mean, it is so infamous, and it's now festooned with bangles. And I mean, it is one of those spots that so many people go to. It's become sort of, as far as I'm concerned, sort of ghoul tourism. And but it is important that people bear witness to it.
Okay, Jamie, that's a good start. To our first main chapter heading, Foundation, the foundation of nations as a result of a massacre. We could talk about the Boston Massacre of 1770, which led to American independence. On March the 5th, 1770, 9 British redcoats shot at a group of 300 to 400 colonists who were giving them some abuse. 5 of these colonists were killed by the soldiers. This was called a massacre by the Patriots, and people such as Paul Revere produced pamphlets which fueled this anti-British sentiment, along with the the famous taxation acts, British taxes on Americans, to help pay for the 7 Years' War. So on both sides, in fact, the Patriots and the Loyalists were publishing materials, spinning it one way and the other, to either downplay it or to upplay it. But it had its part in persuading people it was time to pull away from England.
That's the thing. That massacre, maybe it's too strong a term in this case, given how few the numbers were. But massacre or killings of any kind can be used by either side as propaganda, as a means to fuel their agenda. And it's always useful to a downtrodden or oppressed people that they have something to latch onto, that they have a killing to hold on to and hold up as a sign of the cruelty and barbarity of the other side. And that is why it leads into the foundation myth, because overthrowing the oppressor is really what it's about. Inspiring opposition is what it's about. And so the Boston Massacre is worth holding up in that regard, is worth talking about.
So yes, it's small in regard to, say, the millions who might have died in China or in the Jewish pogrom, but it was latched onto as a way of promoting what they wanted for their future.
Of course, and if you go to Bulgaria and the Bartak massacre of 1876, there you get real numbers involved. I mean, you had a town, a village of 8,000, and some 6,000 were slaughtered there by the Ottomans, by the Bashi Bazouks, the crazy heads, as they were called, this sort of degenerate volunteer group sent in by the Ottomans, a sort of militia. And like a lot of militias, a bit like the Einsatzgruppen and other groups used by the Nazis during the Holocaust, these sort of rather unofficial groups, these paramilitary groups, aren't governed by military norms, and they're the ones who commit appalling atrocities.
I now feel bad laughing at Captain Haddock from the Tintin books, who, when he was insulting someone, would call them, Bashi Bazooks. That was one of his favourite derogatory terms, and I always thought it sounded like, some sort of whirling dervish or something. But they clearly were a lot more unpleasant.
Yeah. Better to be called a blistering barnacle, I think. But
yes,
but
or cephalopod.
but to this day, that massacre at Bartak is seen by Bulgaria as part of its foundation legend, part of the foundation stone of the nation and of national identity.
Well, Walter Bering, who was the second secretary at the British Embassy in Constantinople, sent a report in which he said that the village consisted of 800 houses with 8,000 inhabitants, and that 6,000 had been massacred. And the first thing I saw was some 20 or 30 dogs devouring human bodies, and in the place where they'd been feasting, I counted 62 skulls in about 20 yards. Here, inside and around the church, corpses lay so thick that one could hardly avoid treading on them, and the stench was so fearful that any examination was impossible. The women were sitting on the ruins of their houses, wailing and singing the most melancholy sort of dirge, which could be heard some way from the village.
And you can see that part of the world has its fair share of massacres, again, throughout history. You look at the massacre at Srebrenica, with thousands of Bosnians killed, boys and men murdered in front of the United Nations, dragged away in front of the Dutch peacekeepers. And how that has become part of national legend, that has become part of the foundation myth. It's strange that blood has to be spilt. If you look at the war in Ukraine, no one is ever going to forget Lyman and Bucha. No one is going to forget the man shot on a bike as he cycled by. No one is going to forget these random atrocities committed by Russian forces. That is going to enter the foundation stone, the foundation legend of Ukraine as it emerges from this war.
Still on the subject of formation stories for nations, One of the most famous, of course, is India and Gandhi's role in obtaining independence for that country.
Completely, and it's amazing how one of the moves towards that, one of the things that convinced many people to join that independence movement, and a peaceful independence movement, was an act of violence, the Amritsar massacre in 1919. Here you had a festival of the start of the Sikh New Year, festival of happiness and agriculture. And the situation was misread. Yes, there were protests, but there's no doubt that Brigadier General Dyer, the British commander, really overreacted, and his troops opened fire, and 1,500 people were killed, and probably another 1,500 or more wounded. It was absolute carnage. But you can see that moment, and there were protests against the Rowlatt Act, the idea that people could be detained without charge, detained without parole.
Which had been brought in the First World War because they had to have emergency measures but hadn't been repealed.
Completely, and you see how many laws in Britain have been repealed since the First World War. It's like many forms of taxation come in during wartime. But this massacre, this terrible act of violence, certainly created a groundswell of opposition, certainly helped the independence movement move forward, and that's why it's worth mentioning. Again, it shows that sometimes some good can grow out of these things, that peaceful movements can grow out of violence. And that's why massacres can sometimes signal the end of that kind of violence rather than just the start. Yeah.
I mean, Gandhi's approach to it was very novel, peaceful, non-violent protesting. But as we know, it depends which country you're peacefully protesting against, because there are quite a lot of countries that when you do that, I think of, Tiananmen Square or something like that, where they just move in with the tanks and kill you.
Well, any kind of resistance, certainly in countries that are occupied, for example, you can get terrible atrocities committed against entire towns and villages. And we saw that in the Second World War, places like Lidice or Oradour-sur-Mer. I mean, all these places, that were burnt to the ground and the population massacred. I mean, this is what happens. And certainly, we mentioned in our Civil War podcast things like the Badajoz massacre in the Bull Ring there in 1936. These things, as I said right at the start, are waypoints. They're stepping stones through these overall wars, through overall conflict, and sometimes they can lead to peace on the other side.
A sort of never again. Right, the next main chapter heading is genocide. And nowadays, I suppose, the genocide that's most talked about is the killing of the Jews in the Second World War by the Nazis. But there have been many other examples in the past, and we can go back to 1572 and the St. Bartholomew massacre, which was the massacre by the Catholics of the Protestants. Queen Catherine de' Medici, the mother of King Charles IX, ordered the massacre when the king's sister, who was Margot, married the Protestant King Henry III of Navarre. And he was Huguenot, and many Huguenots gathered in Paris to attend the wedding. Before this, there was an assassination attempt on the leader of the Huguenots, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, which failed initially. But then Charles IX ordered him and the other Huguenot leaders to be killed, and the slaughter just spread throughout Paris and outside the capital. So by the end, between 5,000 and 30,000 Huguenots were dead. And of course, they had the diaspora, which meant many came to England, and why we have that great cultural link to the Huguenots in the city of London, amongst other places.
And it's fascinating that these sort of massacres, when they start, they get so quickly out of control. I mean, it starts as an official policy, but it takes hold. And it often starts with either a coronation or a funeral or a wedding. And
like a bushfire, really.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to London in 1189 and the coronation of Richard the Lionheart, Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard I. The Jews weren't allowed into Westminster Abbey for the ceremony, and Londoners fell upon them and killed them. And that started a wave of killings, a pogrom across England. And so often what happens is that the ideology and the politics or ethnic difference, that is taken up. That these undercurrents already exist and they're fueled. It just takes a spark. And what's fascinating about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is that the ambassador out in Paris at the time, the English ambassador, was none other than Francis Walsingham, the great spy chief of Elizabeth I. And this was before she came to the throne. And he saw what was going on and thought, this is what happens when the Catholics take control. So when Elizabeth became queen and he became her loyal secret service head, he was determined that that wasn't going to happen in England. And so in a way, it goes back to our first category, foundation legend, the foundation stone, that massacre really set in train the thought processes and the security apparatus that protected Protestant England during the Elizabethan era. So you can view that massacre in France as being of seminal importance to what happened in England and the creation of Elizabethan England.
And he was fortunate to have a highly intelligent queen who understood that though his advice was to guard against the dangers of the Catholics, she didn't turn round to him and say, well, let's round up or polish off the Catholics in England, because about half the nation was still Catholics.
Oh, she didn't. I mean, you essentially had to wait till Edward VI for this great sort of Protestant surge and the desecrating of shrines and things like that, the smashing of stained glass. That was the next step.
What did she say? She didn't make windows into the souls of men.
Yes, it's not a bad quote. And after Bloody Mary, I think people were pleased not to have that level of religious intolerance imposed on them,
because it just swung backwards and forwards, wasn't it? I mean, Edward was Protestant, Mary was Catholic, and they just sort of took out the other side each time.
But it always happened. Yeah.
Just so we don't give the impression that all these terrible things happen on the European continent, the Chinese massacre in 1639, also known as the Second Sangli Rebellion, was in the Philippines. So the Spanish were in charge, and there were Chinese Filipinos working out there for the Spanish in the Philippines. They attempted a rebellion in 1603, which failed, and they petitioned the Spanish king for self-government in 1630. This was rejected. The Chinese population in the Philippines continued to grow, so it was at about 33 to 45,000 by 1639. They were well organized, these rebels, but very poorly armed, and they couldn't stand up to the Spanish and Filipino forces. So when they rebelled on the 2nd of December, the Chinese started fast. The Spanish then piled in, and on the 5th of December, any Chinese found, and these were, after all, people who were working for the Spanish-Filipino government, any Chinese that were found were executed, and there was a reward for each Chinese head. So out of the up to 45,000, more than half of them were just killed.
I think this is a problem with any insurgency, any uprising. I think if you're poorly armed, you don't really have a chance. I mean, if you look at the French resistance during the Second World War, exactly the same thing happened. If you don't have training, if you don't have outside help, in this case from the Special Operations Executive in Britain or from the Free French, and you have an arms supply coming in and you have places to hide, you are going to be tracked down. And the fact that the Spanish were offering rewards for every head that was cut off and delivered of a Chinese in the Philippines, that was the incentive for the Filipinos to get involved against the Chinese there. And it's so similar to what was going on. We'll talk about it in our exploitation section with the poor people of the Congo and Belgian Congo, when severed hands became the currency. That's how people earned money. And so people were collecting severed hands. And you can see in so many of these colonial outreaches, certainly among the Spanish, the Belgians, Portuguese, the Dutch, the level of violence going on was extreme, was huge. And, massacre was simply part of the control mechanism. And genocide was not discouraged, shall we say.
We can't talk about genocide without talking about the Jewish genocide. There are so many examples of individual actions in the war, in the Second World War. But Babi Yar is a particularly grim story.
I think they're all grim stories, and apologies really for covering it. But it is important to see how massacre really plays its part in genocide and Holocaust, that they are things that stand out even within the wider atrocity. And Babi Yar stands out because in 2 days above this ravine, 33,000 Jews and Romani gypsies were shot, bayoneted, or thrown alive over the ravine to their deaths. It was unbelievably horrendous. And it was the usual German Nazi Einsatzgruppen involved. And this was part of their industry of slaughter. And one thinks that is bad enough. And it was, until that point, the largest massacre in that time frame during the war.
There was a report by the Einsatz Commando a couple of days after the massacre, and because we talked a little bit about Rampage, which we're coming on to, where things get out of control, but this was so carefully thought out. They in the report, they're pleased as punch at how they dealt with it, because they were concerned about the sheer number of Jewish people who they had to round up. So they had this scheme whereby they put a lot of posters up, wall posters, telling the Jewish population that they needed to go to a certain place so that they could be evacuated to their new homeland. And they weren't expecting it to be as successful as it was. 30,000 Jews arrived, who up until the very moment of their execution still believed it was about their resettlement. And the report finishes with the note, thanks to an extremely clever organisation, it was successful.
Yes, and these reports were always going back to Heinrich Himmler, because that's who they wanted to please. And someone like Heinrich Himmler hated the actual visceral connection with the slaughter. Every time he went to Auschwitz, when he actually went to any of these camps, he was appalled by what he saw.
He didn't have the stomach for it.
He didn't have the stomach for it. It was simply remote killing. And so Babi Yar for him was just another disposal. And the more efficient it was, the better. And of course, one thinks, it couldn't get worse. But then a month later in Odessa, the Nazis then killed 50,000 Jews and cleared out the Jews from that area and massacred them. And not to be outdone, 2 years later, Operation Harvest Festival, as the Germans called it.
In Actian, Erntefest.
Yes. They then went and killed another 45,000 in the concentration camps, helped by the Ukrainian collaborators. It was unbelievably appalling what was going on. But it's so difficult to pick these elements out against a backdrop of overall horror. But it is just worth mentioning these individual actions that were so barbaric and we don't seem to be able to comprehend. But it's worth mentioning just to show that human beings, once they have an agenda, once they're fueled by politics, and once they have this hatred,
an absolution as well, almost, isn't it?
They see it as a cleansing, And it's very easy, whether through politics or through political ideology or through ethnicity and tribal difference, or through religion, to have that view, and that's why it's worth putting genocide into this category of massacres.
We mustn't totally despair about the Jewish Holocaust in the Second World War, because in terms of there being no resistance, I mean, famously, probably most famously, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 was where the Polish Jewish community decided to fight back. 46,000 were killed and captured, of which 36,000 were sent to concentration camps. But it was the largest revolt of Jewish people in the Second World War. There was only one surviving Jewish combat organization commander from it, but he was heard to quote that he did not want to allow the Germans alone to pick the time and place of our deaths.
Yeah, it was an incredible resistance. I mean, amazingly brave. And the Germans just destroyed the entire area. I mean, they absolutely wiped it off the map.
And then a year later, of course, you have the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, which is when the Soviets were pursuing the Germans, the Wehrmacht. The whole of Warsaw rose up. It wasn't just the Jewish contingent. In that occasion, the Germans destroyed sort of 90% of the city.
Yes, and hundreds of thousands were killed in that uprising, and the Soviets had stood back during the clearing of the ghettos, and they stood back during what happened in the Warsaw Uprising, because they wanted the Germans to deal with any resistance groups, because those resistance groups would also have been anti-Soviet. So they were thrilled at what the Germans were doing. And then the Soviets came in and finished things off.
200,000 civilians killed.
Yeah. So it is worth using this really as a sort of a waypoint in genocide. And everyone thought that we had moved on from that. And then, of course, you have the killing fields of Cambodia, and that again was on a different scale of death and destruction.
Well, there's a criticism today that people go on and on about the Nazis, especially younger people, that they're taught about the Nazis, but actually more people have died from communist policies than fascist policies in the last 100 years. And Chairman Mao and what happened in China in the 50s and 60s is a very good example.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary how little it's covered. I mean, some people talk about Stalin and obviously his purges, his terror, the Gulag system. But China has sort of stayed remarkably behind the bamboo curtain, screened off. But if you look at the sort of anti-rightist campaign of the late 1950s, hundreds of thousands of people were persecuted, prosecuted, and executed, tortured. And that was just the start of what happened. As Mao established his authority, created his control, and imposed the one-party state. And because of these centralist policies, there was no give at all. There was absolutely no mercy. And so you had that sort of anti-rightist movement. Then, of course, you got these crazed economic and social policies that matched Cambodia later on for the horrors it's inflicted on its people. I mean, you saw the famine that was induced in the late 1950s by these unbelievably mad campaigns, like the campaign to kill sparrows. 1 billion sparrows were killed by the population on command from the centre. And not only was it a massacre of sparrows, you then got mass starvation because the locusts and the insects destroyed the crops. So mass starvation followed. That was certainly a key part of the end, the byproduct of this killing of sparrows, and millions starved. I mean,
15 to 55 million estimate.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, we cannot even compute the numbers involved. And then again, you get more starvation in the late 60s. I mean, this is during my lifetime. I mean, it's absolutely insane.
Yeah, and just as one example, the Gauzy massacre of 67 to 76, which formed part of the Cultural Revolution, had an estimated death toll of 100 to 150,000, with methods of execution involving beheading, beating, live burial, stoning, drowning, boiling, and disemboweling, alongside lynching, rape, and cannibalism.
Yeah, cannibalism was rife. I mean, it's known. I mean, there was one woman who I think ate dozens of human livers. I mean, in fact, they enticed some fat guy to visit their area just so they could eat him. I mean, this is
she was a real treasure. She ate 6 human livers, cut the genitals off 5 men, soaked them in alcohol, which she would drink later, claiming that these organs were beneficial to her health.
Well, I mean, I guess it's one up on having a worm in the bottom of your alcohol bottle.
Speak for your own worm.
It's absolutely unbelievable.
I mean, we need to lighten the mood a bit. But
yeah, and it's never spoken of. I mean, it's never talked about, and because people go straight from the Nazis and maybe the Soviets, straight on to Cambodia and the killing fields.
Before we move on to the next part, Rampage, we should just finish off with the Cambodian genocide. There's a little bit more to say.
I always feel sort of rather polluted talking about Cambodia and the genocide. It is on a scale and a depth of depravity that one can't really even imagine.
Collective madness.
It was collective madness, and in a way, it sort of fills all these categories that we're covering. But we're putting in genocide because obviously it was genocide, and between a quarter and a third of the nation was killed. Many of them were killed just for wearing spectacles because it meant you could read, and were therefore bourgeois and therefore deserved to die. Whether it was individual killing fields, such as the area at Chung Ek, where it's believed 17,000 people were killed, or Security Prison 21, the security prison collective, where in scores of prisons, hundreds of prisons, the executioners and warders, known as keepers of the peace, executed people in so many different ways. And so often they even used children to act as executioners because children wouldn't question orders. And it was just on an unbelievable scale. In fact, medics, doctors were murdered, and there were no doctors left really in the country, in Cambodia. So you ended up having to use children as medics, as untrained medics, because there were no professionals left.
And it got so out of control that they ended up killing each other.
Well, that's what happens with any paranoid political system. They devour their own. I mean, we've talked about that many times in our podcasts on civil war and revolutions and in despotisms. This is what happens. They destroy their own people because you're always trying to put down opposition or potential upsurges in opposition against you. So the killing fields where so many of these people ended up. So that is really the swathe of history that we cover in genocide. It's the most terrible subject, but it's one that needs to be discussed. And we need to be reminded of it, because it's no point saying it couldn't happen again. It invariably does happen again.
Right, next section, Rampage. Let's talk about the French Revolution and the Terror.
It's worth bringing it in, Tom. Again, so many of these massacres and these horrors can be put in any of the other categories, but it's worth putting in Rampage just to show how things start and how they end up devouring themselves. The participants end up devouring themselves. And once you get the French Revolution, once you get the Committee of Public Safety, headed up by Robespierre. Once you get members of that committee, such as Saint-Just, these are hard-lined. You get the Jacobins, you get the people who are serious revolutionaries, and they want to kill. They don't want to have pity. They don't want mercy shown. They don't want any kind of defence.
They don't want due process, really, do they? And they want to simplify it down to a very basic form of justice.
Completely. Acquittal or death. Those were really the two options. Once you get the Law of 22 Prairals in June 1794, there's no relief for anyone. I mean, there's no mercy. You can't defend yourself. Well, you can defend yourself, but no one's going to listen. You're not allowed lawyers. You're not allowed witnesses. It's you against your accuser. And most people were not acquitted. Most people were condemned to death. And in that period of the terror, around 3,500 people were guillotined, and the tumbrils were working all day. I mean, taking people to have their heads taken off.
And there's always some particular individual who's willing to step forward and implement these gruesome conditions.
Well, of course, we talked about the NKVD chief executioner Blokhin. The terror in France was no different. You were always going to get police chiefs, executioners, prosecutors who were willing to impose the will. And in a way, it is a kind of rampage. It is a kind of massacre. Although this was drawn out. And there were massacres later on, such as the 1871 massacre of the Commune in Paris, and that killed 25,000. And that was far more of a rampage in a way. This was ordered, the terror in a sense, but it fuels a fire, and that fire spreads.
Yet it was inhuman. But so this is Louis Anton de Saint-Just, who was known as the Archangel of Terror. He was on his own very mechanical rampage. So he, for instance, to the army, he insisted on extreme discipline, the Army of the Rhine in 1793, he said to his soldiers, amongst other things, that he'd come to avenge them, and that he said, "We have resolved to seek out, to reward and to promote the deserving." In other words, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He goes on to say, "And to track down all the guilty, whoever they may be, all commanders, officers and agents of the government are hereby ordered to satisfy within 3 days the just grievance of the soldiers. After that interval we will allow ourselves to hear any complaints, and we will offer such examples of justice and severity as the army has not yet witnessed." So he wasn't giving them much of a chance to get their house in order.
Yeah, and didn't he go on to talk about no pity and no mercy?
Absolutely. When they were pursuing the Herbertists, who all ended up on the guillotine, he said, "No more pity, no weakness towards the guilty. Henceforth the government will pardon no more crimes."
Exactly. Well, I mean, look at Klaus Barbie, look at Napoleon's head of police. I mean, these were people who were going out and killing and making a show of it. This was part of policy, part of control, part of spreading a terror and making sure that the regime survived. But those regimes never do survive because they devour themselves.
Yeah, on the 28th of July, 1794, aged 26, he met Madame Guillotine himself.
Yes, and Robespierre and all the others on the committee also went that way. So at last,
watch out,
a proper policy. If you go forward in history, you can go to Bloody Sunday in Russia.
Yeah, that was 1905. I suppose, was it the first sort of firing of the revolution?
It was the first sort of real upsurge, and that was when the Tsar started getting worried.
Well, there were thousands of demonstrators. They were marching towards the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar. Anyway, the army opened fire with 143 to 234 deaths and 500 to 800 injuries.
And it was and it was certainly a precursor to what happened later, and the storming of the Winter Palace. So, and the seizing of that government by the Bolsheviks. So, these things, a rampage can be the start, of things to come.
It's not just communist countries, though, that can suffer from the rampage massacre syndrome.
The My Lai massacre, Tom, and once more, it's worth bringing these moments in because it shows that even an army, even a professional army, can go on a rampage, can get out of control. And although it's not endorsed by senior officials or senior army commanders, it's lowered down the scale, that an army that's been in an area long enough, that's been brutalized, that's frustrated, that's not achieving results.
The red mist descends.
The red mist descends, and you start dehumanizing the population through which you're moving, the villages you're moving. It's very easy to view another culture, particularly when you're there on a military mission, you're fighting an insurgency. You can lose your empathy very quickly, particularly if you're being ambushed. And so it was on that day. The 23rd Infantry Division, men from that division, different troops, attacked that village and massacred the village. I mean, some say up to 504 villagers were murdered. Part of the problem was that actual insurgents were quite often difficult to find, so the only people left were civilians. And so there were terrible examples of children being killed, women being raped, beheadings, torture, you name it. And yes, some people were charged, but only one was given house imprisonment for about 3.5 years. And that was a junior platoon commander. So the ramifications for those who were involved were very, very small.
But it was a low point in American military history. Really.
It was a terrible low point. And the fact that we're talking about it today, it shows once again that a massacre can be a waypoint, a stepping stone.
It was, I mean, they would have learned from that.
Well, not only learning from it, it certainly fueled the anti-war movement in America. Once it got out, it became a total scandal. And in a way, that one incident seemed to encapsulate everything that was going wrong with the counterinsurgency campaign and the war in Vietnam. And so many people start asking, what are we doing and what are we doing there? So that's why it's worth bringing in the My Lai massacre here, because that rampage started things. People look back to it, people talk about it.
Sometimes the intention is not to massacre everyone, but essentially people get massacred, it comes to the same thing. But in this section, we're talking about the exploitation of a country, of a people, to get something out of it, and in the process, vast numbers die.
Yes, so often it moves into the genocide category. And the Belgian Congo is one of the horrors of history. We're talking 1885 to 1908, when King Leopold II of Belgium had direct control of the Congo. All the proceeds went back to him. It was his personal wealth, his personal edict. So it was supreme command, total command of that colony. And the result was death on an unimaginable scale. I mean, millions died. And it was because rubber was important. It was an important commodity. Children were used in mass numbers. They were sent into the forest because you couldn't get mules in or donkeys in. And so children and other villagers were sent in. They had to slice the rubber plants and allow the latex to cover them. And then they would come out and have the rubber scraped off them. I mean, this is how you farmed rubber in the Belgian Congo. And they were visited the whole time by local commissioners. And were the villages unable to produce enough, then hands were cut off. And severed hands, became a currency in the same way that severed heads became a currency, not just a trophy, in things such as the Chinese massacre in the Philippines. I mean, this was just standard practice. And you had people like Five, who was the commissioner, the governor of the Equator region of the Congo. And he
The devil
destroyed.
of the equator.
Yeah, the devil of the equator. I mean, he destroyed 160 villages. He was burning crops. He was mass murdering people. You look at Conrad's Heart of Darkness of 1899, and it just shows this depth of depravity, this depth of horror. This is why it became a useful template on which to base Apocalypse Now, this voyage down a river to see, what happened in the heart of this terrible darkness that
was sliding into hell, like Hades.
Well, it was, and these dreadful characters, these satanic characters who controlled the local population and were feeding on the fear, feeding on the terror. And feeding on the resources that the local population were producing for them. And it's extraordinary that you contrast that with John Buchan's Press to John, which had a far more upbeat view of empire and colonialism. I mean, that was 1910. And there you had Rider Haggard heading in to find this magical kingdom, this kingdom of gold and other resources. But it had a far more positive attitude towards colonialism. And there was none of that level of oppression that was going on in the Belgian Congo. I mean, the Congo really stands out. And there are photographs of Belgian missionaries, holding up, standing next to children, holding up their arms and their severed hands on them. And this was what was going on in the Belgian Congo. So it was exploitation and it was genocide.
Staying on the continent of Africa, but further south on the west, in Namibia, we've got the Germans are in charge of that particular colony in Namibia, southwest Africa, and the Herero and Nama people come into a horrific collision with the German command.
They do, because the Germans, again, not only did they want order in the area, they wanted to exploit it. And there was an upsurge of anti-German feeling in German Southwest Africa. And so the Germans went into action and they forced hundreds of thousands of Nama people and Herero people into the deserts. They put them on a place called Death Island or Shark Island, into concentration camps. And these weren't the same type of concentration camps that the British put Boer prisoners in, or Boer women and children in, who then died from disease. These were torture camps. These were death camps that was explicitly set up to kill the local population, to subdue them, to pacify them, and destroy them.
And downstairs, I've still got my grandfather's kit bag from the campaign of 1914, when the Rhodesian army kicked the Germans out of Namibia, and he, as a bugler and private soldier, was in that particular regiment.
Yeah, and it was a tough slog. I mean, and the desert regions, I mean, they were very harsh environments.
Skeleton Coast, isn't it, and all of that?
Yeah, and there was certainly a lot of human skeletons around by the end of that particular massacre, that particular policy of pacifying the population. Then you go later on in that century, we're talking the 1930s of the Nanking Massacre.
This is Japanese invasion of China.
The Nanking Massacre shows what can happen in war when an invading army, the Japanese Central Army, moved forward. Chiang Kai-shek took his army out because he didn't want it surrounded or slaughtered. And what was left was a sort of ramshackle militia that tried to hold up the Japanese advance. So once the Japanese get in, they destroy it, essentially. And we know about the Japanese atrocities in China. I mean, you look at Ningpo, when they first used plague, they were trying to spread plague with bombs filled with grain and fleas. But Nanking, it just stands there as one of those horrendous massacres. And once more was part of not just a genocide, but an attempt to exploit the resources that China had to offer.
All right, Jamie, our next and final section is titled Cull, the Pragmatic application of psychopathy?
Well, that's how I would describe it, Tom. Yes, I call it pragmatic psychopathy because it's expedient for political leaders or military commanders in many situations throughout history simply to kill, to rely on expunging the opposition, of cowing the population, of getting rid of rivals. And this is a large section because there's so many aspects of the cull that they're really just an adjunct part of warfare in many parts of history. They're part of genocide. They're part of overall policy. So the cull is important.
I mean, the definition of cull is to reduce numbers, isn't it? Normally an animal in the wild, you need to reduce the number of deer or something like that. You cull them, you kill off a percentage. It's very unemotional.
Yes, or you kill off a particular breed, or you kill off a particular rival. You can come to the present day and you see August 23rd, 2023, you see Yevgeny Prigozhin culled. 7 hierarchs of the Wagner group suddenly crashing in a fireball in their private jet north of Moscow.
I think I'd call that an assassination.
But it's also a cull. It's also the desire to behead that hierarchy. And it's exactly the same number as the number killed in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, of course, plus three aircrew. But, that's a modern version. You can go back in history to King Edward I and his culling, his massacre of 15,000 civilians in Berwick-on-Tweed, which really announced the start of his invasion in 1296 of Scotland. There was the Scottish king, King John, making an alliance with France, and up comes Edward I saying, we don't want this. We don't want you to have an alliance with a hostile nation. You owe your loyalty, your fealty to me and to England. And so you can view that as a cull as well. It's part of the overall warfare. It's part of the political approach and the warlike approach of that monarch. And it's a useful policy sometimes for those leaders.
Right. Well, let's look at a specific example. In 88 BC, we had the Asiatic Vespers.
Because Mithridates VI of Pontus had this creeping paranoia of the influence of the Latins, of the Roman people in his area.
He wasn't wrong, was he?
Well, in that part of Asia Minor. And what did he do about it? He creates a situation in which the population rise up, and there is a cull. There's a killing of 80,000 Latin people to put them in their place, to make sure that they don't rise up. It's this belief that you have to behead the serpent. And once you've done that, once you put it to rest, it won't rise again, or it will take a long time to reconstitute.
And that, in fact, started the first Mithridatic War between the Roman Republic and Pontus. And, of course, the Romans won.
Well, there was always going to be this sort of fractious relationship between the Roman Empire and the spread of Roman influence and the periphery. And so those peripheral countries, those nations, whether they were rising up in civil war or they had leaders who didn't want to see their authority questioned, were going to take action against it. So you're always going to have these flare-ups.
Okay. 1,000 years later, in 1099, we had the Jerusalem massacres around the time of the First Crusade.
There was a strong political dimension as much as a religious dimension to that crusade. It was the crusade of the barons, really. It was the crusade of all those Norman knights. We mentioned Duke Robert of Normandy in our podcast on royals in war. Well, here's the eldest son of William the Conqueror heading down on that crusade. And once Jerusalem is taken, massacre ensues, and it's completely out of control. It is a massacre, and the descriptions are quite extraordinary and very grisly, very gory in what they say.
To quote, "Our men followed, killing and slaying even to the Temple of Solomon, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles." And also, "At the dawn our men cautiously went up onto the roof of the temple and attacked Saracen men and women, beheading them with naked swords. Some of the Saracens, however, leapt from the temple roof. Tancred, seeing this, was greatly angered."
And there's also evidence, and certainly chronicles and people who are writing about this, that children were roasted on spits. I mean, it was unbelievable wholesale slaughter. But you could view this as a cull. What's extraordinary, it was a cull of both Jews and Muslims. The Crusaders weren't picky. They simply wanted to seek revenge. They wanted to impose their will, and they wanted to ensure that no one could stop future pilgrimages to Jerusalem. This was now their domain. This is what they were going to control for the next 200 years. And so it was a policy.
And 100 years after that, we've got the Massacre of the Latins in Constantinople.
In 1182. Here was Emperor Andronicus watching the influence of Latin city-states growing in Byzantium. And so he saw the Venetian fleets grow, the influence of Venetian merchants grow. And you can see this in the Crusader kingdom as well, the antagonism and the rivalry between Pisa, Genoa, Venice. When you come to the fall of Acre in 1291, you get all the sort of clashes between those different groups. And that's why the sultans of Egypt could take advantage of those rivalries and move in.
So there's sort of no love lost between the various different groups?
None whatsoever. It was a sort of fratricide, if you like. And so Emperor Andronicus in Byzantium took advantage of this as well. He saw the Venetians growing in influence, so he encouraged the Pisans and the Genoese, and then realized their influence was growing, and he had created this monster.
So he just kept going.
So again, this was his policy. He decided we must have a cull. So he had a lot of popular backing. He was a populist. So what should happen? The population go out and they slaughter. And I think they killed about 60,000 in that particular massacre, in that cull.
There were only 4,000 survivors from the Genoese and Pisan communities, and they were sold into slavery to the Sultan of Rum.
Well, there you go. So not only is there a cull, but there's enslavement as well. So there is always that pragmatic aspect to it. It is policy, if you like. It is part of the overall policy.
And also, I mean, Andronicus had a plan, which was to unseat the child emperor Alexios II and install himself. And so in doing all of this, he managed to achieve that, and everyone was executed or massacred, including the regent, who was Emperor Alexios's mother, Maria.
And a Catholic, I believe. So again, there's this.
He was clearing house.
He was clearing house, and you start getting this sort of clash between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and different empires, different aspects of the empire, East and West, and it all feeds in. And there's nothing like feeding sort of populist fervour for a ruler to get people on his side and act as his executioners, as his cleansers.
Constantinople seems to crop up almost every century. The people living there get it in the neck from someone trying to take over the city, as in 1204, when there was 2,000 civilians killed by crusaders who were passing by. The crusaders broke into the imperial crypt, where they found Justinian I's body fully intact without any decay.
There you go. But I think if you're always at the frontier of an empire or the outpost of an empire, you're always going to be on the receiving end from either party.
It was a huge prize as well, wasn't it?
It's a huge prize, and it's always sort of the result of politics and things that have gone wrong. And that crusade, 1204, it was supposed to head, of course, for the Holy Land, but it never got there. And people say it was because the Pisans let them down and didn't provide the ships, or were asking too much money. And so they were angry. And
was it a classic case of the soldiers ending up basically attacking the baggage, effectively, getting sidetracked by the riches on the way?
And they don't show mercy. I mean, they go out and kill because they're angry, and so they want their just rewards. So they go out and get them. But
then finally, in 1453.
Well, then you get Mehmet II. Then you get the Ottomans coming in, and absolute slaughter taking place there. The massacre inside the Santa Sofia, and it's complete collapse of really Byzantium. That is really the end of Christianity in the Ottoman world, in that part of the world. So there was always this problem. And if you're on the outer edge of an empire, for example, the Crusader Empire or the Latin Empire, you are going to be hit by factionalism and by enemies coming in from the east.
But it's a pretty impressive length of empire, wasn't it? Byzantium was really the tail end of the Roman Empire,
but it waxed and waned, and that was one of the things that and some of the emperors were totally mad and totally either incompetent or mad, and that was the history of most empires, I suppose, whether it was the Roman Empire based in Rome or the Roman Empire based in Constantinople. It had good leaders, it had terrible leaders, and ultimately it was too far extended and could no longer hold on against the massed forces of Islam.
If we move to the 17th century in China, just briefly, the notable thing was the size when there was a massacre. The decimal point is moved extravagantly to the right.
It always is in China, whether it's the size and scale of the battles or of the massacres. I mean, the massacre at Assheton, they say, was about 1 million people were killed. At Yangzhou, they say 800,000 were killed, and the descriptions are unbelievable. I mean, we don't want to terrify our listeners, but it is staggering, the scale of slaughter.
I could give you a bit, and you can tell me when to stop.
Now.
Okay. Before we get to organs trampled like turf. Yeah, okay.
Yes, as a baby's lying.
Canals filled with bodies.
Yes, and that it could describe any massacre anywhere on earth. But as you say, the scale of massacre in China, just as when we mentioned in our podcast on contagion, that the scale of loss in the 1950s and the 1960s through government policy, you could say in a way that was a cull. Sometimes it was through incompetence, sometimes it was a deliberate policy, and so this sort of carries on through history. But if you want an example of a cull, of a sort of politically motivated cull, in terms of putting down opposition, of ensuring there are not rivals coming up again, of ensuring that any nascent revolt is suppressed, you could look at the massacre, the cull, at Wounded Knee. It's a fascinating example of how scared authorities can be of something they don't understand, of a movement that has a spiritual dimension. You can see this in China, you can see this in so many places where there's an undercurrent. And so in 1890, you had the Ghost Dance War. You had Native Americans doing their ghost dance, believing that the Indian chief Wovoka had this vision that the dead would come back, the chiefs of the past would come back to join their earthly cousins, their brethren, and help them defeat the American army. And so you get the 7th Cavalry moving into the area of the Lakota Sioux. and killing in this massacre at Wounded Knee in December 29th, 1890, 250 women and children. And it was a terrible massacre.
How was it a cull, though?
Well, it was a cull in that it was political. I mean, we talked about this pragmatic psychopathy, this idea that you can use violence simply to suppress, that it will make a statement, it will make a difference, and that it will cow those who are watching. You know, the news will spread and it will kill off, in this case, the cult of the ghost dance. I mean, the ghost dancers believed that their outfits could ward off bullets, for example. And you've seen this in so many places in Africa and other parts of the world, where a religious movement starts or a cult starts, and they believe that the spirits will protect them, or their clothing, their magic items will protect them, their charms, talismans will protect them against the force of the enemy. In this case, it didn't, although the women and children obviously weren't armed anyway. The men were away from the camp. And if I can give a shout out for a friend of mine here, Susanna White, the movie director, who did a fantastic film called Woman Walks Ahead, with this story of the ghost dancers and of Chief Sitting Bull, who had been linked to the Battle of Wounded Knee and Custer, and was this legend. There's this amazing scene where his circus horse that he has, because he joined, of course, Cody's circus, and was given this circus horse. And there's this amazing bit at the end where the circus horse does this dance, almost like a ghost dance, but actually it's a horse, not the locals doing it at the end. But it's a lovely film, so it's worth watching.
What's it called again?
It's called Woman Walks Ahead.
Right.
Because it was about this American woman who was obsessed, this white American woman who throws the portrait of her husband into the river and goes to seek out Chief Sitting Bull on his reservation where he's retreated. And it's an amazing story and a really great film. I love that film. And so well done, Susanna. And I think even De Niro enjoyed the film too.
Right, enough name dropping.
Yeah, that's my plug for the day.
Well, and about the same time, 1894 to 1897 was the Hamidian massacres.
The massacre of the Armenians by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans have a terrible history of slaughtering the Armenians. Far more than that were killed later on. So this has gone on through history. Again, it's policy.
It's still an open wound today, isn't it?
It is an open wound. And so often, as we mentioned right at the beginning of this entire podcast, these massacres are often waypoints, that they're part of the foundation myth of nations, but they're also a sore. This is a running wound that goes through international relations within communities and between states.
You, Jamie, mentioned the massacre at the Katyn Wood of the 22,000 Polish officers by the Soviets. And it is worth mentioning the victims included an admiral, 2 generals, 24 colonels, 79 lieutenant colonels, 258 majors, 654 captains, 7 naval captains, 85 privates, and 3,420 NCOs, amongst others. This was all done by the NKVD.
And you can see that this is policy. This is on the direct orders of Stalin.
Yeah, secret orders.
The secret orders of Stalin. And it was seen as necessary. It was a way of beheading the Polish opposition, of killing off the Polish army, the entire leadership.
Well, they killed. Yeah, they executed almost half the Polish officer corps.
Yeah, this is exactly what was required. And the fact that the Soviets never admitted this till 1990 speaks volumes about the secrecy and the bloodshed and brutality of the Soviet state and of the Russian nation, I might add. And we're seeing it again today, in the same way that the torture chambers that are being uncovered in every liberated town and city and village in Ukraine, that is there as direct policy. It is there to cow. It is there to control. It is there to ensure that opposition does not raise its head. So this is why it's useful to look at massacres. It's not a pleasant subject, but it is part of history.
And lastly, before we move on to our postscript, we have to mention the worst genocide since the Second World War, 1995, Srebrenica.
8,000 Bosnian Serbs, boys and men, taken out and killed, and essentially handed over by the Dutch, who were there to guard them. I mean, and it was part of this policy of clearing 20,000 Bosnians out of that area, out of Srebrenica, and so this was the end result.
Why did the Dutch hand them over? Were they just outnumbered by the Serbs?
They were outnumbered. They were poorly led. I think they have been castigated and condemned for what they did. It has cost the Dutch dear, I think, in terms of reputation, in terms of their moral stance, their ineptitude and lack of professionalism, and their sheer inability to stand up for what is right. And so they stepped back and let the Serbs move in. And it was a cull on the part of the Serbs. It was horrifying. And if you're going to be a peacekeeper, if you're going to move into an area, have the backbone to actually keep the peace. That really is the moral. But it's worth mentioning. It's worth sort of showing this as it's a yet another stain on history, but it's certainly a stain on the reputation of peacekeepers.
Do you think they had the the rules of engagement? Were they allowed to open fire? Was it the leadership, the political leadership, or was it the man?
It's a combination of both, and I certainly know that there were British officers out in that part of the world who saw what was going on in parts of that conflict, and with the collapse of Yugoslavia and the Civil War, who just couldn't believe that Allied armies were not stepping up, that forces were not stepping up to do what they were sent to do, or that the sort of rival forces were not actually stepping up to fight in the way they should have fought. So there was a lot of frustration, a lot of confusion, and a lot of different agendas going on. It's always been said, for example, that the French allowed all the Serbian war crimes suspects to escape by tipping them off, because, of course, France were friends with the Serbians. And so that was one of the byproducts as well. So all the way through, you have, the policy of the Serbs, and then you have the weakness of Western nations that allowed it to happen, in the same way that one could say that the weakness of the West allowed Putin to get away with it for so long. So this is one of the reasons that massacres happen. People don't step up, people don't see what's happening, or choose to not see what is happening. And that is really one of the lessons of history, of course.
Okay, postscript time. Postscript. That's been quite a tough run through on massacres, so we'll end with a famous mini-massacre, the 14th of February 1929.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Who can forget it? It has entered folklore and entered many movies, and it's when members of the North Side gang, 7 of them, were lined up against a wall by 4 men, 2 dressed as police officers, 2 carrying shotguns, 2 carrying Tommy guns, and murdered. It was the enforcers, it was the hierarchs, really, a bit like the Wagner group crashing. But the one person who wasn't there was George Bugs Moran, the head of the gang, the North Side gang. And it was the height of prohibition, it was the height of gangsterdom. You had this rivalry born of not just of business rivals and crime boss rivalry. You had this rivalry between different nationalities. The North Side gang were essentially Polish and Irish, and Al Scarface Capone, of course, was Italian. So it's really the Italians versus the Irish and the Poles. And it's the same dynamic you see in cities like New York, the same tensions, the same trying to carve out the crime lands, the hunting grounds of each group.
The famous thing about it also was the use of the Thompson machine gun, the Tommy gun.
Yeah, and the Tommy gun, the word iconic is used far too often, but it was and is iconic. I mean, Winston Churchill was photographed carrying a Tommy gun.
And didn't Hitler just call him a gangster?
Completely, and it became the weapon of choice of gangsters, and of course of many soldiers in the Second World War. I mean, well over 1 million were produced in the Second World War. It was actually invented in 1918, first produced, but was too late to enter service and production at that time, because the Americans wanted a weapon that could clear trenches, and this had the ability at 150 feet to wipe out anything in front. It was 45 caliber. It was a heavy weapon. It weighed 14 pounds, fully loaded. Compared to that in the Second World War, the Sten gun, for example, it was sort of twice the weight of an empty Sten gun. So it was a heavy beast and expensive. In the late 1920s, it was about $200, and some say that's about sort of $3,000 plus today. So it wasn't cheap, but it was a damn good weapon. It was very useful and much sought after.
And also famously used by the SAS commander Paddy Mayne in the North African desert, 14th of December 1941. Tamet in North Africa, where the German and Italian air forces had their air bases.
Yeah, it was one of those great SAS raids involving jeeps driving onto the airstrip and blowing up planes. But it was also notorious because Paddy Mayne entered the officers' mess and managed to gun down with his accomplices, his men, 30 pilots and aircrew. Both Italian and German. But it has to be taken into account that the SAS, as they are now, were strategic troops. They were there to destroy enemy air power, and you had to do that by killing pilots and by destroying aircraft. And it's worth remembering that by the end of the war in North Africa, the SAS had destroyed more German aircraft than the Royal Air Force had in North Africa. So they were extremely useful. So that incident has been sort of focused on, but it must be taken into account that those troops on that mission didn't have the room to take prisoners. And who knows if any of those Germans or Italians had actually responded and caused the firefight that followed, the massacre that followed. But that is the sort of line of the Tommy gun. That's the history of the Tommy gun. It was used for clearing out, and it did a very good job. So it's probably worth bringing that in at this point, the Tommy gun in terms of its use in massacres. So that is our postscript today.
I have to say that I would have loved to have had a go with a Tommy gun. It would be a very cool weapon to try out.
I think any submachine
on a
gun.
range, of course.
Yes, I've only fired a Sterling submachine gun, and
they're
that
terrible. I mean, we had to fire those things. They were made out of old bed ends.
They were just sort of pea shooters. But
the notable thing, if you look at the early Star Wars movies, the very first one, the stormtroopers are carrying their laser weapons. All they are is a SMG with the stock folded away. That's what they used.
Yes, and yes, they would probably have indulged in massacres too.
I'm sure. Well, Jamie, thank you for laying out, explaining all the different types of massacres that people get up to, whether it's the foundation of nations, genocide, on a rampage, exploitation of other people, or the cull. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
So it goes. You've been listening to Bloody Violent History with Tom and Jamie. Please pass this podcast on, and thank you for your support. And good luck.